I never planned to unravel my entire life in 1 week, but that's exactly what happened the day I decided to run from my troubles. It all began with a single, catastrophic mistake. I broke every vow I'd ever made, trashed my finances, and nearly got locked up. My name doesn't matter because it doesn't feel like mine anymore. For the last few months, I've stumbled through each day in a haze of regrets. One evening, after throwing back a few too many drinks at a sad excuse for a bar, I heard a stranger mention a place that would hire, no questions asked. That phrase lodged itself in my mind, echoing again and again. Maybe it was exactly what I needed, a blank slate where nobody would know my past. And I was desperate enough to chase that rumor all the way to the edge of the known world. I sold my few belongings and bought a coach ticket that took me halfway across the country, eventually landing in a crummy station surrounded by miles of emptiness. The final stretch was a single-lane road leading deeper into the frigid north. What little I knew about the region came from half-whispered stories. Colossal expanses of ice, months without sunlight, merciless predators. None of it seemed to matter at the time. My only focus was escape. That's how I ended up in a broken-down diner, shivering, exhausted, and feeling like the last person left on Earth, begging for directions to the rumored place of employment. An older trucker, wearing an oil-stained jacket and reeking of cigarettes, squinted at me through the haze of smoke swirling around his booth. When I approached, he'd finished a plate of fried eggs and was sipping black coffee out of a stained mug. I can still recall every rough crease on his face as he said, "Heard about that job site, have you? If you're looking for no questions asked, you found it, but you best be ready, son. It ain't civilized up there." He wouldn't elaborate further. He just gave me a bitter laugh when I insisted on details. But he did say there was a man at a warehouse in the Arctic who always needed an extra pair of hands, especially hands that didn't meddle in his business. I nodded like I knew what I was getting into, though fear took over my gut. When the trucker finally dropped me off hours later at an intersection battered by an unforgiving wind, the roads were deserted. The only lights came from a single gas station and a sign too iced over to read. I had nothing in my pockets except a few crumpled bills. It had to be enough. I managed to hitch another ride north, squeezed in the back of a supply truck. Each time we stopped, I realized we were leaving civilization further and further behind. That final driver gave me one last warning. The sun's about to disappear for a good long while. Once it's gone, you won't see it again for weeks. At the time, I was too numb to care. The thought of perpetual darkness seemed almost comforting, as if it could hide every sin, every shameful deed I'd committed back home. We eventually reached a tiny settlement clinging to the edge of the tundra. It was more of an outpost than a town, just a diner, a motel that smelled of mold, and a grocery store with a half-frozen neon sign flickering in the gloom. People there barely spoke to outsiders. All the same, when I mentioned the warehouse, I saw the color drain from a couple of faces. A manager at the motel gave me a rude nod when I asked for a room. He had a wary look in his eye, as though I just declared I intended to walk off the edge of the earth. "Sure that's where you want to go?" he asked. "Folks who head up that way don't often come back. Or if they do, they're different." But I was out of money, out of luck, and fresh out of alternatives. At dawn, I woke up to see a monstrous pickup truck parked outside the motel. Its headlights cut twin beams through the swirling snow. In the driver's seat was a massive man, nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill the entire front bench. He introduced himself as Roke, the foreman at the warehouse. His voice rumbled like distant thunder when he said, "Heard you're looking for work. Get in." I accepted without hesitating. Something about his tone told me there was no real choice. My hands shook from the cold as I climbed up into the passenger seat. I expected some small talk, but Roke rarely spoke. He seemed perfectly comfortable with the endless wind blasting across the tundra and the knowledge that soon the sun would vanish. It was a 2-hour ride before we reached the property line, which was marked by a battered wooden sign with chipped black letters I couldn't quite read. Whatever they once said, they were too worn down by the elements. Beyond the sign, I saw a towering building, long and squat with floodlights fixed along the roofline. But those lights were off now. No one needed them. Not yet. Roke led me through an enormous steel door to a space that felt like an aircraft hangar. The interior was lined with crates, metal shelves, and rows of forklift tracks scuffing the concrete floor. A few overhead lights buzzed with a cold, fluorescent glow. The air smelled faintly of engine oil and something vaguely like bleach. There wasn't another person in sight as we trudged toward a narrow hallway at the far side. That's when I met the only other occupant of the warehouse, a man they called Scarrett, though the ragged line across his cheek made Scar Cheek a more obvious nickname. He barely looked up from the battered desk where he was hunched over a ledger and a half-eaten sandwich. When he did glance at me, his eyes were as cold and flat as the ice outside. "New hire?" he said, slurring the words with mild contempt. Roke nodded, then took me aside, explaining that the operation here was simple. Keep the building powered, handle incoming or outgoing shipments, though he didn't specify what those shipments were, and above all, stay out of trouble. You do your 12-hour shifts without complaining, keep everything running, and you'll get a payout when winter ends. No one asks where you're from or why you're here. That suit you? It had to, so I said yes. My mind spun with questions I dared not ask. There was no visible sign of modern technology beyond a diesel generator, some battery backups, and a tangle of wiring that wound around the walls. They didn't even have a single computer anywhere in sight. Everything was scribbled on laminated charts in black marker. Scarrett's personal office was a cluttered corner of the building near the break room. I saw he had two sidearms tucked at his waist, clearly meant for more than just show. When I first asked if he worried about thieves, Scarrett gave me a chilling grin and said, "Out here, the only thieves are the things that come crawling in from the dark. No matter how many times I tried to pry, they wouldn't reveal exactly what was stored in the sealed crates. Maybe I wasn't ready to know." Roke told me my first shift would start that night, just before sunset. It took me a moment to register how pointless that phrase was out here. The sun had barely risen above the horizon, and from that point on, it would just sink lower until it never rose again. Over the next few days, my routine fell into a bleak pattern. Wake up in my cramped, musty bunk, check the generator, inspect the perimeter floodlights, make sure the main building's internal systems, air circulation, heating, power distribution were running correctly. Then I'd pace the corridors until my tired feet ached. The only human contact I had was with Roke or Scarrett, though calling Scarrett human sometimes felt generous. He only ever asked me about the tasks we were assigned. Fuel's running low in tank 3, top it up, or take the forklift and move that new crate. Outside, temperatures plummeted well below zero, and the daylight hours shrank to minutes. By mid-November, we were plunged into near-total darkness. That's also when the first rumors started creeping into my head. Up here, everyone swapped stories about the frozen wastes. Mythical creatures, vanished explorers, entire expeditions found scattered or half-consumed by something lurking out there. I was tempted to dismiss it all as local superstition, but at the same time, this place had a weird energy. The wind howled, rattling the warehouse walls like a wild animal. Some nights, I could have sworn I heard scratching on the metal siding outside. One evening, I found Roke cleaning and loading a shotgun. He didn't look like he needed practice. I muttered a question. "Are we expecting trouble?" He shrugged. "We might. At the edge of the world, everything out there is hungry, especially during polar night. Some folks talk about wolves, others about beasts no one's named yet. Doesn't matter. You see shadows moving in the distance. You keep your mouth shut and stay in the light." Then he handed me a flashlight with a massive battery pack. "Never let it die on you." After that cryptic warning, I grew more anxious. Whenever I stepped outside, I felt I was being watched. My breath would freeze in the air as I scanned the pitch-black surroundings, hoping not to see any flicker of movement. And for a while, that was all I experienced. Pure, inky darkness beyond the glaring floodlights, and a constant sense that something was standing just outside their reach. It was December by the time the uneasy calm broke. I was outside one night, checking a row of fence posts near the northwest corner of the property, when I spotted something in the snow. Tracks. Not human footprints, not a boot or shoe. They looked like elongated paws or hands, pressed deep into the icy ground. My flashlight revealed a trail that zigzagged in from the tundra, circled the fence line, and then disappeared behind a drift. I could almost imagine a hunched figure scuttling around the perimeter, searching for a weakness. My pulse pounded, and I felt an urge to call for Roke, but a stubborn part of me wanted to handle it alone. The tracks were old anyway, maybe a day or more. A part of me insisted it might be a large Arctic hare or some other creature, but it didn't feel right. That same night, I heard Scarrett cackling to himself in the break room as he polished his pistols. "Anything interesting out there?" I asked. He looked up, still grinning. "Interesting? Sure, but not the good kind. If you see them, you shoot. If you can't shoot, you run. If you can't run, well," he shrugged, "guess you won't be coming back inside." I hated the way he spoke, always sounding like he wanted trouble to come knocking. Without waiting for me to react, Scarrett strode outside for a perimeter check. I watched him go, the door banging shut, leaving me to brood in the silent corridor. Every hour that passed with those odd prints in my head made me more uneasy. I combed through the warehouse, checking angles, verifying the doors were locked, but an oppressive sense of fear grew inside me. Something big was about to happen. I just didn't know when or how. On the 7th day of constant darkness, the power lines began to flicker. At first, I noticed a slight dimming in the overhead lamps. Then the massive floodlights outside blinked off for a split second, enough to plunge everything into total blackness. darkness. When they snapped back on, my heart was beating heavily. If those lights stayed off, it would be open season for any predator lurking just beyond the fence. I sprinted to the generator shack, braving the sub-zero gale that threatened to peel the skin off my face. No matter how often the job required it, going outside at night never got easier. The wind was a relentless beast, howling loud enough to drown out my own thoughts. Roke joined me, scowling at the generator's display. "Something's draining more power than usual. We gotta check the cables," he said. But as we started lifting access panels, the ground vibrated under our feet, like a low rumble carried by the ice. Scarrett sauntered out with a flashlight in one hand and a pistol in the other, barking at us to hurry. "We got shadows dancing on the horizon," he growled. "Multiple shapes. Might be beasts sniffing around." My breath caught in my throat. Roke's jaw set into a grim line. "We can't let them out of the darkness see that the lights are failing. If they realize it, they'll rush us, and we can't hold them all off." He told Scarrett to stand guard while we finished hooking up the backup cables. Even with gloves, my fingers were stiff from the cold, and every metal surface felt like it could rip the skin right off my hands. Sparks flew as we rigged a temporary fix. Once we got it stable, the lights resumed their full glow. But as we moved back toward the warehouse door, I saw shapes at the far edge of the floodlight's reach. Their outlines were gangly and elongated, with limbs too long for any normal animal. They moved on all fours, skulking around. Then, as if sensing our gaze, they slunk back into the blackness. I couldn't see them clearly, but the glimpse was enough to haunt my sleep for days. The next morning, or what passed for morning in the eternal night, I asked Roke what he thought they were. He just shook his head, refusing to speculate. "Doesn't matter," he told me. "Just keep the generator running and the lights blazing. We're safe as long as they stay out of range." That safety net broke soon after. One evening, the entire warehouse shuddered with a deafening thud. I almost dropped my coffee, panic rising in my chest. Scarrett snatched his pistols and yelled for me to check the monitors. We had a basic camera system covering the outside doors. On the tiny black and white screens, I saw something had slammed into the thick steel overhead door near the loading bay. It was dented from the force. A claw, long and pale, scraped across the camera lens before the feed cut out, leaving us blind. Roke bellowed for me and Scarrett to follow him to the loading area. My heart pounded so hard I thought it'd burst. The loading bay door was partially jammed open, letting a knife of freezing air slice into the warehouse. Whatever had slammed it was nowhere in sight. Scarrett stepped forward, poised to shoot at the slightest motion. Snow swirled in from the gap, swirling around his ankles. Then we saw what lay just outside, sprawled near the massive dent. Two of those monstrous shapes lay dead in the snow, bodies riddled with bullet holes. My mind reeled. Scarrett must have shot them from a prior encounter, so why the crash now? I didn't have time to wonder. More shapes lurked beyond the threshold, waiting for a moment of weakness. One of them crawled on its belly, half hidden behind a crate of old forklift parts left outside. Roke managed to slam a lever that started lowering the bay door again, but that gap took forever to close. Meanwhile, the creature lunged, raking claws at Scarrett's leg. He fired point blank, the muzzle flash illuminating a nightmare face, stretched too thin, eyes like black marbles. The bullet tore through its skull, but not before it let out an ear-splitting shriek that seemed to echo. My blood turned to ice. When the bay door finally sealed, I slumped against the wall, panting. Scarrett cussed under his breath, a fresh slash visible through his torn pants. Roke locked down the manual override, face pale. "They're testing us," he rasped. "They want in." That realization felt more horrifying than anything else. We caught a glimpse of how deadly they could be in open combat, and now we faced the possibility that they were coordinating an attack. Intelligent or not, they knew the building had weak points, and they weren't about to give up. The next few days were a waking nightmare. Every so often, the exterior floodlights would flicker, prompting us to scramble and inspect the power lines. We set up rudimentary barricades in front of each entrance, including the massive loading bay. Sleep became elusive. Every gust of wind sounded like claws raking metal. Scarrett prowled the corridors at all hours, searching for any sign of infiltration. Whenever he spotted a faint shadow near a window, he'd pepper it with gunfire, shouting curses at the top of his lungs. Roke finally snapped that Scarrett was wasting ammo, but Scarrett shot back that it was better to waste bullets than to end up eaten alive. During one especially tense shift, I was tasked with checking the perimeter fuse boxes alone. My flashlight wavered in the gloom as I crept through a seldom-used corridor at the far edge of the warehouse. A single flickering bulb overhead cast dancing shadows. Halfway through my inspection, I heard a scraping sound from the other side of the thin metal wall. Something was rubbing against it, slow and deliberate. My heart thudded so loud I was sure it would give me away. Then a sharp clank reverberated, like metal being bent. My mind raced. Were they trying to force an opening? I pointed my flashlight at the corrugated sheet metal and listened. A low hiss, almost like breathing, drifted from outside. I backed away, step by step, terrified terrified a single slip might invite those claws right through the wall. I rushed to tell Roke, and his expression grew more grim with every word. "If they're starting to test the walls, we've got bigger problems than I thought," he said. After a pause, he added, "We keep the power running no matter what. That's our only real defense. If they flood this place in total darkness, we're done." There was no argument from me. If I could have installed floodlights in every inch of that warehouse, I would have done it, but resources were limited. The generator was only so powerful, and night was now unrelenting. They attacked as a group on one of the longest nights in mid-December, about a month into the polar night. I'd lost track of the actual date. Time no longer had any meaning in that eternal blackness. Scarrett and Roke were on one side of the warehouse, investigating a bizarre rattling noise from the generator. I stood near the control panel that housed all the circuit breakers, trying to reboot a malfunctioning row of lights. Suddenly, the interior lights dimmed and flickered. An alarm beeped on the generator console, which was barely audible over a roar from the far end of the warehouse. I spun around in time to see the main double doors buckling inward. It wasn't a single creature, or even two. There had to be half a dozen, maybe more, ramming the steel with savage determination. Before I could do anything, the panel shorted out completely, plunging the entire interior into darkness. I heard Scarrett shouting, his voice echoing through the black void. "They've cut the lines! Get the backup on!" My fingers fumbled for the emergency lever. Even though we'd practiced the sequence, my body was shaking so badly that I could hardly find the controls. When I finally yanked it down, the emergency lighting flickered to life, casting the scene in a dull, reddish glow. In that hellish illumination, I saw the doors crash open, torn from their hinges. Shapes poured in. Their limbs were hairless and emaciated, their faces sunk in pits of shadow. They moved like a swarm of insects, clambering over one another to reach us. Scarrett unleashed a hail of bullets. Roke bellowed, brandishing a shotgun that echoed with each blast. The creatures hissed and shrieked, their voices a bone-chilling cacophony. I tried to stand my ground and aim a rifle that Roke had given me days before. My shots were shaky at best. One bullet found a target, knocking a beast sideways, but the rest soared wide. A clawed limb swiped at me, forcing me to stagger back. Then Roke lobbed something, a flashbang or improvised explosive. Light erupted in the gloom, and the creatures recoiled, scattering momentarily. The stench of gunpowder and blood filled my nostrils. "Fall back," Roke roared, gesturing for me to retreat deeper into the building. We barricaded ourselves behind a heavy sliding partition door that separated the main open space from the smaller rooms. Scarrett was bleeding from multiple gashes, and Roke's left arm hung at an odd angle. I locked the partition door in place, my heart slamming against my ribs. For a moment, the only sounds were ragged breathing and a dull thud of claws scraping on the other side of the metal barrier. "We gotta get the main lights back on," Scarrett growled, pressing a makeshift bandage to his side. "The red glow won't keep them away for long. They hate bright lights." Roke groaned, pain twisting his features. "We'll never make it to the control panel in time." His eyes flicked to me, desperate. "Unless one of us draws them off." The words sank into the frigid air. We all knew what that implied, a potential sacrifice. But we had no choice. The longer we waited in darkness, the braver those things would become. "I'll do it," I said, the words coming out shaky but certain. My entire body trembled with adrenaline. Scarrett opened his mouth to argue, maybe to call me a fool, but he was too weak from blood loss to stop me. With no time to waste, I grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight and clipped it to my belt. Then, taking one of Scarrett's pistols, an old revolver with a full cylinder, I mustered every ounce of courage. I slipped through an auxiliary door that led into a narrow service corridor. My plan was to circle around to the generator area, then double back to the control panel on the main floor. The corridor was pitch black, except for the faint red glow through vents in the ceiling. My breath came ragged, each exhalation fogging the freezing air. Ahead of me lay the heart of the warehouse. Behind me, somewhere, were Scarrett and Roke, still barricaded with no guarantee of survival. Halfway down the corridor, I heard a frantic skittering. I flicked on my flashlight. Its beam caught the side of a creature's face. Waxy skin stretched tight over bone, with two black pits where eyes should be. It shrank back, letting out a pained hiss as the light seared its vision. I fired the pistol. The shot slammed into its shoulder, spinning it around. I barreled past before it could recover, not daring to look back. My only objective was to keep the flashlight aimed forward, scaring off anything that rushed me. A side entrance opened into the generator room, where overhead emergency bulbs flickered weakly. The machine sputtered and spat, smoke rising in thick plumes. Some cable had been torn apart or overloaded. Tools lay strewn across the floor. Gritting my teeth, I rummaged for the spares we kept in a metal locker. My shaking hands fumbled with wrenches and replacement wires as I did my best to patch the feed. Any second, I expected to feel claws slashing across my back. But by some miracle, I managed to rig a connection that stabilized the generator. It roared to life, brighter lights blinking on above me. I sprinted out, the flashlight bobbing across the floor. I heard bestial screeching echo through the corridors, those creatures outraged by the rising glow. I still needed to reach the control panel to power up the full floodlight array. My lungs burned, and every muscle screamed to stop. But I made it to the large open area where the main breakers were. The overhead lights were half alive, strobing. It was enough to see them, dozens of beasts, bounding across the floor, their gangly limbs contorting at unnatural angles. My heart seized. They'd infiltrated so thoroughly that there was nowhere to run. A cluster blocked the route back to Scarrett and Roke. Then I noticed something. They were fixated on me, drawn like moths to a flame, but terrified of the partial light. With each strobe, they recoiled, hissing. Summoning whatever nerve I had left, I squeezed the flashlight in my left hand and fired off a round from the pistol with my right, scattering them momentarily. I leapt toward the control panel. My fingers found the big lever marked floodlights. I yanked it down, praying it would do more good than last time. In a split second, the entire building surged with power. High-watt bulbs flared, flooding the warehouse with brilliant white beams. Every corner was illuminated, leaving no safe pockets of darkness. The creatures let out a collective, agonized shriek that rattled my skull. Scrambling in blind panic, they fled the building in a chaotic stampede, smashing through the half-broken doors and retreating into the night. A rancid odor lingered in their wake, but they were gone, scattered back into the icy wastes. My knees buckled, and I collapsed against the control panel, adrenaline fading into crippling exhaustion. The overhead lights hummed reassuringly, and I realized I was still alive. Somehow, by a thread, we'd held them off. After a breathless moment, I forced myself up and hurried to find Scarrett and Roke. I found them crouched behind the metal partition, half-conscious, battered, and bleeding, but alive. Without a word, Scarrett gave me a shaky thumbs up, then frowned at a fresh wound on his neck. Roke just exhaled relief, his eyes flicking around in disbelief that the building was empty once again. We knew better than to think it was over. The polar night still had weeks to go, maybe longer, and those creatures were out there. Injured, perhaps, but definitely not extinct. Even if we survived the rest of the season, what then? The nearest town was too far for any rescue to reach us in these conditions. We'd have to hold out until sunrise returned, if we could. Now, every corridor in the warehouse is drenched in light, every switch locked in the on position. The generator's been reinforced with spare parts, and we take shifts dozing in corners, always armed and ready. Outside, the endless night persists, a silent realm where the wind howls and unnatural shapes loom just beyond the perimeter. We've cleared away the bodies from the initial attack, both beast and human, but the memory remains. Every scratch, every dark stain on the concrete is a reminder that we're trespassing on a domain that doesn't belong to us. I don't know if we'll make it, but for now, each flicker of the overhead lights sets my heart racing, because one power outage could seal our fate. Sometimes I pause near the entrance, press my ear to the steel door, and listen. In the distance, I still hear them, the scuttling, the hissing, the promise that until the sun rises again, until that first golden ray breaks the horizon, nothing is certain except this oppressive darkness. And in the darkness, they roam freely. My name doesn't matter, but if someone ever finds this tale, at least you'll know there were 3 of us here, trying to hold back the nightmares. If the sun never comes, I guess you'll know how it ends. I keep telling myself, just make it to sunrise. But as I write these final lines, something heavy bangs against the far door. My flashlight is charged, the floods are blazing, and I am as ready as one can be to face the unknown. If it's them, well, I have no choice but to stand my ground, because there is no running from this place, not in the middle of a polar night that shows no mercy. And if you're watching this, if you're hearing my story, pray you never come this far north, where even the smallest flicker of light can mean the difference between life and a nightmare crawling beneath the ice. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales.